Now, as I said earlier, this video would deal with not just the fifth estate or game journalism for online publication, but of the decline of their profession. Because, as I see it, there's a lack of accountability in what they do, and in the end it only hurts us, the consumer. We rely on game journalists to report factually to us about everything from the specifications of new hardware to the ease of use of a new game. We trust that their pieces will be written in an honest and straightforward manner. Yet, when you take the time to look at the current state of this new generation of online journalists, what you end up seeing is a profession which has done itself a disservice. They've done this in a few ways, whether it's allowing their advertisers to corrupt their articles, being bought by companies to offer praise rather than truth, or just being apathetic to the point of misrepresentation of the facts. Some have even gone as far as to outright lie for no other reason than they can. I'd like to cite a few examples now for you to show you just what I mean and to help illustrate just how prevalent this perversion has become. So let's begin with something small and work our way up. The first is an article written by Justin Culvert of GameSpot, which he wrote back in November of 2006. The piece was about a hands-on demo he had at the Ubisoft offices for the game Far Cry Vengeance on the Wii. This is an excerpt from the article he wrote in which he talks about the controls for the game. This is what he had to say. We're pleased to report that after about 10 minutes of walking around and surviving encounters with enemies, more by luck than by judgment, we were playing on the easiest difficulty setting, we came to grips with the control setup and ultimately found it to be quite intuitive. Later on in the same article, he goes on to talk about the difficulty he had in using grenades, but then follows it up with this statement. Judging the distance of our throws proved to be quite difficult at first, but after spending a few minutes at a practice range, conveniently located in one of the game's 3 new maps, we found that the system worked well. Now, I bring this up as my first example because you would be hard-pressed to find any gamer who would say that the controls for this game were either intuitive or easy to pick up. In fact, aside from it being one of the worst-handled ports for the Nintendo Wii, it was also one of the most difficult to control, with a whole host of bugs in the game that caused many people to have issues. As I said, it's a small example, but a valid one. Why would a game journalist, and yes, Justin is one, after all, he's been doing it for well over a decade, having gone from print media to online media for GameSpot, say that a game which was universally panned for bad controls had intuitive ones? After all, this is a man who's had years of experience both playing games and reviewing different aspects of the industry. Yet, in this hands-on exclusive prior to the game's release, he praises it for its control. How many people listen to what Justin wrote and purchase a game merely on his reporting? How many people put their faith into his words, and how many were burned by it? The next example I have is of a game journalist by the name of Jim Sterling from a website called Destructoid.com. It deals with an article he wrote about Halo Wars, a game for the Xbox 360. Now, Jim wrote his piece, an in-depth review of the game, and published it on the website. The problem with this? Well, allow me to quote Ron Workman, since he puts it better than I could. After reading Jim Sterling's review of Halo Wars, I was convinced he virtually didn't even play the game. Then, as someone at the party this weekend was smart enough to look up an in-depth game stat, he didn't even finish Chapter 3. Anything past it, never played multiplayer, which is basically the point, and could have made it through what he did in an hour or 2 at most. Now, while our first example with Justin Culvert dealt with what could be seen as trying to play politics by giving a favorable review in hopes of creating or sustaining a working relationship with an industry publisher, this example deals with a weak, almost apathetic work ethic. Again, this is a journalist who purports to give you a fair and balanced in-depth review of a game and yet doesn't take the time to play it for more than an hour, nor to check the features of the game such as multiplayer. And while Mr. Sterling did eventually go on to amend his previous review by playing the game through properly, one has to question whether his motivation was more in an effort to save face, rather than to be a responsible journalist. If not for Ron Workman, would Sterling have gone back and given the game another go? And if he was willing to do it with Halo Wars, what other games might he have done it for? Would you feel comfortable basing a purchase off of his work after finding out that he doesn't really play the games the whole way through? While Culvert and Sterling's actions are questionable, the piece which Kotaku did about Fatsuma raises even more issues. Now, I had stated earlier that I wanted to deal with game journalists online, but I felt this was important to include because of just how shocking this sort of allegation is. Fatsuma is the largest Japanese gaming publication, and it was one of the most trusted as well. Yet, as Brian Ashcroft points out in his article for Kotaku.com, there are some serious issues going on with advertisers pulling in favors to get good ratings. This has to do with the game Peace Walker receiving a perfect score of 40 out of 40 from the magazine, a magazine which, for a long time, rarely handed out this honor, reserving it only for the best of the best. And while I have yet to play Peace Walker, and can't fairly judge its merits, Ashcroft lists a host of reasons as to why this should be questioned. A link to the full article is included in the description, and I encourage you to go check it out for yourself. My final example is, to me, perhaps the most damning. It's the most damning because of the amount of game journalists it involves, the recentness of its occurrence, and what I see as a disgusting violation of what it means to be a journalist of any kind. It happened at this year's E3 during Microsoft's presentation, and I have the portion in question for you to be able to watch. I ask that you watch it and see if you can spot what I'm talking about.
Well, I'm excited to share that we're shipping the new Xbox 360 to retailers today. And it will be available in stores later this week. Unless you were here in the audience at the Wiltern Theater, in which case we're shipping the new Xbox 360 to you right now on us.
To me, this is clear-cut bribery, plain and simple. Microsoft bought the men and women in that room. There is no excuse for accepting that kind of money in any form, whether it be in cash or property. It calls into question your ethics if you do. It doesn't help matters either that they all stood and applauded. Now, can a group such as those in attendance claim to be unbiased and impartial when the company whom they'll be reviewing later on gives them something valued at around $400? Would you accept this happening in any other context? These examples I've listed are but just a few. There are many more, and sadly it seems to be all too common nowadays in game journalism. If you remember earlier when I spoke about what it meant to be a journalist, when I discussed having principles, being honest, and reporting factually, I meant those things. I've encountered some who've said something along the lines of, well, it's just video games, who cares? I don't base my purchases on what someone writes. Or, it doesn't matter to me. My rebuttal to that is, and? Should an entire profession not be held accountable merely because you don't care? Is your apathy an acceptable reason for them forsaking their duty as journalists? If I didn't care about whether or not my doctor was honest with me and sought to do me no harm, does that mean that you shouldn't get upset if he lies to you and then violates your health? Both professions take an oath which is similar, and both deal with honesty and factual reporting. So can my dismissal of one profession's oath excuse their behavior to you? Of course not. We should expect more from our game journalists. They should be honest, have integrity, report fact, uphold their journalistic principles, refrain from being persuaded by the bribes of companies and the pressures of advertisers. We should remember that, in the end, if you choose to call yourself a journalist, regardless of the medium in which you work, that the onus is on you, and not us, your reader.